Digitalis purpurea, the foxglove, a quintessential English wildflower. Standing up to shoulder height, tall spikes of bright purple-pink flowers cut across the mushy pea green of an English summer. But be aware, both a poison and a cure, foxgloves can pop up almost anywhere. Well, apart from all of that, Foxglove is also the name of a London-based, and get this right, tech justice digital rights law firm who, in their words, stand up to the tech giants and governments for a future where technology is used for the benefit of everyone, not just the rich and the powerful. Wow. So I'll be honest, tech justice is not something I thought the world needed until probably a couple of years ago. So mid-pandemic, when an email landed in my inbox telling me I had less than a month to opt out of a government scheme before my, and anyone else who didn't get the memo, our medical records would be made available to third parties, basically private companies, government agencies, and so on. And what made me pay particular attention to this was this campaign was coming from a group of concerned frontline medical doctors, the Doctors Association UK, who were working together with Foxglove to raise awareness about this scheme. Now, all of this has been, and it actually continues to rumble on since 2021, but it wasn't until December of last year, 2023, when I finally got a chance to catch up with the directors of Foxglove and get them on the podcast. So this is where I learned more about the fight for digital rights and tech justice, and where I learned that this is a war with battles being fought on many fronts. I mean, obviously, some of this tech is great. We all use it. There must be something good about it. But we do know that it is impacting everything from our most intimate relationships to our communities, to society, to our democracies, the whole hog. And this is where Foxglove comes in. So let's talk about them. I've mentioned them a number of times. The directors of Foxglove are, well, these are my words now, 3 kick-ass lady lawyers, women in South London, Corey Crider, Martha Dark, and Rosa Curling. So let's start with Corey. Corey Crider is a US qualified lawyer with a really impressive track record in litigation, investigation, and public advocacy, which includes taking on the UK's mass surveillance spying practices. Just one of the many things that she does. So Corey sits on the Scholars Council of UCLA Centre for Critical Internet Inquiry, so that's C2I2, and is also on the advisory councils of Data for Change and Clean Up the Internet. Then there's Martha Dark. Martha has over a decade of experience in building and managing social justice organisations. So in addition to her work at Foxglove, she is Chief Operating Officer of Open Rights Group. This is the UK's largest digital campaigning organisation, as well as being on the boards of the European Digital Rights Network and Fair Trials International, which does exactly what it says on the tin, upholds people's rights to a fair trial. Last but not least is Rosa Curling, who moved across to Foxglove from Lee Day Solicitors, which is, when she was working there, it's a UK-based law firm specialising in human rights, employment, personal injury, medical negligence, and more. And Lee Day, I was just reading this is bonkers. They've managed to recover £1 billion in compensation. So this has been recovered on behalf of clients who have been injured or discriminated against or had their human rights abused by the UK government or large corporations. Now, I'm just going to let that sink in for a second, because the fact that we need representation to recover that kind of money from our own government and large corporations is actually a little bit scary, but okay, I'm glad someone's doing the work. Anyway, I'm sounding flippant. This is really serious stuff. I caught up with Martha and Rosa, like I said, in December of last year, 2023, where honestly I felt like a little duck flapping frantically, trying to keep up with these 2 powerful, high-altitude flying geese who were very gracious to take me along with them under their wing as they covered all sorts of ground, from Facebook whistleblowers like Frances Haugen and Daniel Moton to data grabbing and a whole lot more. What is clear is tech justice is something we are going to need a lot more of for quite some time if we're going to want a freer, fairer, cleaner world. So let's dive in and hear from Foxglove themselves.
I'm Martha, and together with Rosa and our friend and colleague Corey, we started Foxglove in sort of mid-2019. And Foxglove exists to make the use of technology fair. So we investigate and we litigate and we campaign, ultimately bringing cases against both big tech companies and government when they use technology to abuse their power. And we've been doing this work for kind of 4 or 5 years now, and the work's always in partnership with others, so with other lawyers or civil society groups, unions, impacted people and workers. And we sort of have 2 areas of focus. One looks at the way that the government uses mass data systems or algorithms in decision making and some of the issues that stem from that. And the other area of work looks at the kind of huge power that big technology companies are amassing and have amassed, and some of the societal problems that stem from that. And we also work to support tech workers who are badly treated by those companies too.
Wow. Okay. So you're quite busy then. Rosa, how about you? So how did you all meet? I don't know if, Rosa, you want to tell us a bit like who you are and how did you begin?
By background, I'm a UK lawyer, and Martha, Corey and I all worked together for several years before we decided to forget the other jobs and to form Foxglove and try and take on big tech in the way that Martha has just described. I think we feel very, very strongly that the tech corporations and the nation states aren't going to build a fair tech future themselves, and that we have to demand it. And obviously that demand can take many, many forms. And at Foxglove, we specialise on litigation and campaigning and investigation and some communication as well, trying to join hands with as many people as we possibly can to win some of the kind of tech power back. And as Martha was saying, we do a mixture of litigation against both the companies and against the government. And it's not that we think law is necessarily the kind of panacea to everything. It's going to solve all of our problems. But we think it is a very important tool. And it's a tool that we definitely felt was not being used at all, really, which is one of the reasons that we formed. So we were aware there were lots of human rights panels and internal investigations into kind of tech abuses or exploitations. But actually, there wasn't really very many people suing them. And we felt these people did need to be sued because they had a kind of attitude towards the rule of law as if it was somehow something that they didn't have to follow. But we also think that the size of the company really matters. These are huge corporations, and it's very important that we tackle how big they are, because that size is what really makes them so powerful. And we need to try and make sure that the technology, which there is no kind of preordained direction to any of this technology, nothing of it about it is inevitable. These are choices that have been made, and we feel that the technology companies have been making choices that are about their own profit and have seriously harmful impact on our communities, on our democracies, on our tax systems, on our environment. And we, 3 women in South London, decided we wanted to try and do something about it. And that's why we formed Foxglove.
Why did you call yourselves Foxglove?
Oh,
So that's a great question. That I love when we get asked that. It doesn't happen very often anymore. And also, actually, so I'll explain why, but the foxglove's an English wildflower. Mm-hmm. And since we've started working more internationally, the amount of people who've said to me, is it, to do with a fox and a glove or what? Like, what is it? So we called ourselves Foxglove because a foxglove is an English wildflower that crops up where you least expect, in the way that we hope we might too. And also the foxglove is both a poison and a cure in the way that we also think technology can be.
Because you started Foxglove in 2019. There was sort of murmurings about social media, particularly, in terms of like how addictive it is, and maybe not quite in the public consciousness in the way that it is now, the influence on political outcomes. And certainly, like, I think for a lot of people, 2020 is when this really came to the fore, courtesy of the Netflix film, A Social Dilemma. And that was the first time I'd come across this organization, the Center for Humane Technology. And it's almost like I had to sort of tap the brakes and think, well, is technology inhumane? How is it inhumane that we need a Center for Humane Technology? I know that's not directly connected with your work, but can you tell me what was the conversation that the three of you had when you were like, I think we need to do this. Somebody needs to do this.
I think it's very important to say out loud, social media platforms are highly curated spaces. A handful of corporations are dictating what you see in terms of what comes up and what is now in our public square. And I think it is now, as you say, people have become more and more aware about the devastating consequences of some of the decisions that have been taken by corporations about how they decide to curate those public spaces, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, whichever one you want to talk about. And we've worked with two really fearless whistleblowers over the last few years, Frances Haugen and Daniel, who both blew the whistle about what was happening, for example, at Facebook. And one of the things I think I would be really keen to try and talk about and have as part of the conversation today is that there is a really invisible kind of hidden underside to all of this social media platform work, and that is people. And maybe, again, just to think about something that's very much in the news at the moment, one of the kind of most, I think, one of the kind of technologies that's being talked a lot about at the moment is ChatGPT and OpenAI. And that's a kind of, in some ways, a seductively simple idea. You type in a prompt, ChatGPT spits out a response, and it reads as if a human has written it. And like much of the kind of tech hype that we've seen over the few years, this has brought in billions of pounds. I mean, it's extraordinary the amount of money that it's brought in. And on one level, maybe we can see this as a very exciting tool. But on another side, I think there is a hidden story that is really not discussed enough. And that's about the kind of foundational myth that big tech kind of continuously speaks about, as if there are these kind of tech unicorns and these kind of Silicon Valley individual genius men, they are always men, who got together to build artificial intelligence to the world, and that these very kind of clear heroes are really the kind of, the real wonders of our time. Whereas actually this myth leaves out the most extraordinary number of individuals, and indeed a huge, completely invisible labour force of thousands and thousands of exploited workers. And so we've been trying to work with content moderators at Facebook to try and expose that. So to train the OpenAI, to train, for example, ChatGPT or to train AI in general, OpenAI, the company, basically sucks content from the internet. It drinks up all of what I would say is some pretty toxic content and hate that you find on the internet. And in order to address the fact that actually what could get spewed out of ChatGPT could also be full of this kind of hatred and toxic content, they employ thousands of workers to try and make sure that the information that comes out is not full of sexism and not full of racism. And that subcontracted workforce are the absolute core, crucial workforce of all of these different technologies, whether it's social media, whether it's OpenAI. All of these technologies are absolutely dependent. They are critical on the work of these individuals. And these individuals get paid $2 an hour. And they report endless exposure to the most traumatic content, and of course are suffering from horrendous mental health problems as a result. And these companies provide them with no proper psychiatric or psychological support. And we have a situation here where we have the kind of engineers in Silicon Valley getting paid, $2 million a year to write the algorithms, And the data labourers in Kenya, for example, being paid less than $2 an hour to draw out that poison that has been extracted from the internet. And they are the ones who have to try and clean up that content.
Oh
and that
my
inequality
gosh.
is so stark and so easily avoidable.
I just want to make sure I've just understood that, because this weekend, Elon Musk famously told the CEO of Disney and anyone else who doesn't want to advertise on X to go fuck themselves. So that was a clear message. But in that same talk, he was talking about how OpenAI, I think, I can't quote directly, I paraphrase, but he said something about it being just a flat lie, that it wasn't using copyrighted data to train up AI platforms. But what you're saying takes it a step further and makes it even worse than what he's saying, which is they're actual human filters that AI are using. So, Martha, you're nodding.
What Rosa said is completely right. I think it's a huge misconception that these technology platforms have been built by a couple of geniuses, and across all of the companies, whether it's, as Rosa was saying, ChatGPT or Facebook or Twitter or any of those big tech companies, or Amazon even, those companies' success is as a result of the intense, often exploited labour of thousands of workers across the world. And I think particularly in the context of data labellers and content moderators, that work is quite hidden on purpose, I think, by those companies. And so Facebook, for example, we know that there are thousands of content moderators across the world in lots of different countries. We don't know exactly how many there are because Facebook hasn't said. And we don't know exactly how many are employed by different companies because they're all outsourced and treated rather horribly, as Rosa described. But the truth is that none of the platforms can exist without that workforce. And it's quite convenient for, I think, people like Mark Zuckerberg to talk a lot about the AI, and the AI will fix this, the AI will be the solution to content moderation. When actually the reality is, I think those technical systems are a really long way away from being able to moderate the platform in a way that's safe for users. And so, in my view, there'll likely always be a role for content moderators, for human content moderators who do this incredibly important work. So if we use Facebook as an example, social media content moderators are a kind of army of workers who are the internet's essential workers, we would say, essential safety workers. And the platform just couldn't exist without them, really. Certainly not a safe platform. And the kind of day-to-day job of a social media content moderator is to review a piece of content. That might be a photo or a video or some text, and make an assessment about whether that piece of content is in line with Facebook's policy and therefore can stay up on the platform, or whether it, breaches a policy and therefore should be removed. And the people that do this work, as Rosa was saying, are outsourced largely to other companies. And it's a really highly skilled job in the sense that often it requires multiple languages and the ability to interpret Facebook's sometimes like super quick changing policies. I remember, for example, in the context of war in Ukraine, the policies were changing all of the time, and moderators have to interpret those policies, apply those policies often really quickly, at the same time as having these incredibly hard to meet goals around how many pieces of content have to be reviewed. And one of the big things to know here is that most of the content that's been flagged for review is content that is, considered by perhaps a user to be unsafe to be on the platform. So a lot of it is really traumatic content. It might be child pornography, it might be extreme violence, it might be hate speech. And that is a pretty awful thing to view once, let alone sort of for 10 hours a day or 9 hours a day. And as Rosa said, without any proper meaningful psychiatric care that means that people can do that work in a way that doesn't cause them long-term mental health problems. But it also has serious impact on the way that these social media companies treat these workers, and they treat them so terribly. Actually, it does have a meaningful impact on the safety of the platform for users as well as those doing the work.
And also, can I add in what I think is such an important revelation from Francis, which is that actually things are very bad here, but things are so much worse when you go outside of Europe and the US. So one of the things that Francis so fearlessly and so importantly revealed was that Meta has a really wonderful way of organising its finances. So it has basically clumped into what it calls rest of world, almost the entire world, save kind of US, Canada, and Europe. So you have, you basically have rest of world receiving 13% of the misinformation budget that Meta allocates, and 87% of it going to basically the US and Canada. So what that means is that Meta spends money on trying to prevent hate speech, prevent incitement, prevent misinformation in those countries for those users. But when you go to rest of world, and that very, I would say, neo-colonial word that Meta chooses to call the rest of the world, doesn't even bother with the word the. What they're saying is those users of the platform in those other countries don't matter. And to make that even worse, just to explain a little bit about what that means, we're taking a case about what happened in Ethiopia and Facebook's role in the conflict there. And what was absolutely stark was that Facebook, and what was told to us, is that Facebook played the kind of role of the radio in Rwanda. That's what it did. It incited violence, it incited hatred. And one of the reasons that the platform became so awash with this kind of content is because the algorithms that Facebook and Meta have trained to try and pick up some of the most toxic content, they haven't bothered to train it in, I don't think, in any of the 83 or 85 languages spoken in Ethiopia. And we know that the content moderators that they have chosen to hire, this is the company has chosen to hire content moderators in 3 of those 85 languages. So in Ethiopia, there is no content moderator for any of the 80 plus languages, and the algorithm doesn't pick up any of the hate speech or the inciting posts that come up onto the platform. So of course, at moments of, conflict or crisis, what happens is the platform becomes completely awash with that kind of content, with absolutely disastrous and devastating impacts. We're representing a wonderful young man who lost his father because his father was doxxed by 2 posts on Facebook that called for his death. And within 10 days, despite our client Abraham reporting this post as toxic, saying, this is like a death warrant from my father, you must take these posts down, nothing happened. The posts remain, and his father was killed outside of his family home. The decision to not invest in people, to not invest in algorithms so that they actually speak the languages that Facebook is choosing to operate. Facebook has chosen to go into Ethiopia. It's chosen to go into Kenya. If it makes that choice, it needs to make sure that its product is in fact safe. And at the moment, they are choosing not to spend the money. And this is simply about money. They could clearly afford to hire so many more content moderators. They could clearly afford to train the AI in those different languages, and they have chosen not to. And it is completely unacceptable. That's me being polite.
Can I add one thing to that? I think one thing that kind of starkly contrasts how Facebook treats the English-speaking world with the rest of the world, to use their term, is something also that Francis revealed, which is that in the context of the Capitol riots on January 6th, Facebook made a series of changes, which we now know are called the break the glass measures, which were changes to the algorithm. So in the knowledge that the algorithm amplifies certain types of content, hateful content most often, they made changes that dimmed down the ability of that video content particularly to be shared very widely on the platform. They did that within a matter of 3 hours, I think it was, Rosa, right?
Yeah.
And so we know that they can do that, but as in the same way that Rosa was saying in terms of choosing not to invest in moderators to safely moderate the platform, they're making a choice not to make that investment, for example, in the context of the war in Ethiopia and the very serious impact that that had on Abraham and presumably hundreds of thousands of other people.
And it's not to say what happened in Capitol. I mean, what happened in Capitol Hill was awful. But in Ethiopia, 600,000 people have died. And Facebook has elected to not use the break the glass mechanism to make sure that content is really muted and prevented from being shared. Like, that is a corporate decision. So when I say that these technologies, there's nothing inevitable about them. These are choices that have been made by the company. And to be frank, governments have been failing to regulate them to make sure that this is no longer allowed. We should let you get a word in edgeway.
No,
Sorry.
it's good.
We haven't stopped talking.
No, please don't. No, absolutely not. And I think it is good to just have like a little bit of a free flow, because you alluded right at the beginning, Rosa, you said, that these platforms are highly curated. And I think most people have a level of awareness of this, that, you're in an echo chamber and you get sort of corralled, funneled down into little sort of spaces that, will cater for your likes, but probably more importantly, your dislikes and the things that you really engage with on a negative level. So I think that concept is out there. I don't know how many people really embrace that, want to know about it, or even know about it at all. But certainly the idea that these algorithms push content that it thinks, I guess, whether you engage with it in a positive way or in a hateful way, you're engaging with it. And it goes, you engage with this, so we'll give you more of the same. Or maybe give you more of the same, but a little bit more extreme. And let's turn the volume on that, so that's the bit that kind of freaks me out. Because like
it's even more sinister than that.
Well, go on then. I'm not sure. I'm going to brace myself for this.
In the sense that it's not just that users are being served pieces of information because it means, that they're more likely to click on it or read it. These platforms know that the types of content that keep users most engaged, which means more revenue in their pockets from advertisers, is content that's sadly most likely stories that appeal to our basic instincts or that trigger outrage or fear. And so often those are posts that are horrific and not things that should be shared. But because the kind of shock factor or whatever it is about the human nature that means that those are the things that do go more viral, it's a conscious business decision to, keep eyes on screens and therefore money in pockets by amplifying and sharing content that's harmful and shouldn't be shared, frankly.
Just while we're on the topic of what is the responsibility of these platforms, how does the law come into this? Because from my point of view, the way I see all of this is there's a lot of stuff online that I don't like. But my question is, who gets to decide, right? And is that something that the law can help us with?
I think the law can help in part. I think it's definitely not the full and only answer. I guess speaking personally, and I know that kind of Corey and Martha are the same, I think one of the real benefits that we see in litigation is partly that, one of the jobs I did prior to becoming a fully qualified lawyer was I worked in the policy department at various different civil society organisations. And one of the things that I personally found quite tricky about the policy work is quite often you'd put out a paper and you'd send it to MPs, or you'd put it into the kind of send it out into the world. And it was quite hard to know how the people in power were engaging with it. It was quite hard to assess the impact. I think one of the kind of personal pleasures of litigation, and I think one of the things that our clients really value, is that the reality is that there is a court and nobody can run from that court. There is a judge, there's two sides. You have, in essence, a kind of, I would say, a sort of play of morality in reality in terms of our cases. To think about, for example, we're doing alongside the Ethiopian case we've talked about, we've also been doing a series of litigation in Kenya trying to get better working conditions for content moderators for Meta, and also to ensure that they have the right to join a union, because one of the things that's happened is Meta and the outsourcing companies involved basically sack anyone who tries to form a union. And we have been challenging the mass sackings, but also we've been trying to ensure that there are better working conditions by seeking the court's intervention. And so there you have are incredible clients who have the courage. And I mean, I think it's really important to recognize and value and just really take a moment to appreciate the courage it takes. We have in Kenya, there's about 184 content moderators who are currently suing Meta. These are 184 individuals who are from a variety, some from Kenya, some from Nigeria, some from Ethiopia, from a variety of different countries, who have chosen to come together and to sue one of the most rich, powerful companies in the world, and to do that in Kenya. So you have there, I think, a very interesting, I would say, moral play or drama between what I would say is a very clearly, and I'm obviously biased, but clearly correct position that actually content moderators need to be valued and cherished and should have proper working conditions and be able to join a union, against a company. And in the case of Meta, we have a company that is trying to argue, one, that the courts have no jurisdiction over them at all. I'm just going to say that again. The Kenyan courts have no jurisdiction over Meta. That is their argument, that they operate in Kenya, but actually the Kenyan court should have no jurisdiction over what they do, which is wild. Anyway,
so they essentially operate above the law.
Exactly. That the Kenyan law doesn't apply to them, which is crazy. I'm pleased to say the Kenyan courts disagreed with that and did agree that there was jurisdiction for them to hear the case. Meta are, of course, appealing that, so that the case will continue. And of course, they have endless amounts of money to throw at this. Like, they have resources that are so huge that they don't even need to hesitate about thinking about appealing whatever they don't like in terms of any decisions that have been made. Ultimately, I think I'm very, very hopeful we will win. I think even if we end up right at the top court in Kenya, I think we will win that. But what's happening in that case is, in essence, an argument about whether the rule of law applies to Meta, an American company that has come into Kenya, and whether, in fact, the Kenyan laws, Kenya has an incredible constitution, which makes absolutely clear that if you are choosing to operate, and the constitution applies to the companies in the same way it applies to the government, if you're choosing to operate in Kenya, you have to comply with the Kenyan laws, and the Kenyan laws require you to provide a healthy and safety working environment, which in the case of content moderators clearly involves being able to be given proper psychiatric and psychological support, because you've literally just spent 8 hours of your life watching, children being raped, people being beheaded live. I mean, it's the most traumatic content. And there is no proper care for these individuals. And they are paid a measly amount of money. And the second they start to demand change, the second they start to ask the company to comply with the law, there is a mass sacking that they try and pretend is a kind of sham they do like a redundancy program. But let's be clear, it's a mass sacking, and all the individuals who had been working in that particular outsourcing company are then told they can't move on to the next outsourcing company that Meta's choosing to partner with. So the law, in that case, I think the law is very clear, and it's very, very useful. It's very clear that if Meta is choosing to operate in Kenya, the Kenyan laws apply. The constitution guarantees you the right to be able to join a union. It guarantees you proper working conditions. And we obviously have an argument about what that in fact means in the context of being a content moderator for Facebook. But that's the way in which the law can help. So in that case, we're demanding that the court intervene. We're asking them to confirm, and indeed we have won so far. Of course, Meta is appealing again, but we've won a judgment which makes clear that content moderators do need to be given proper psychological and psychiatric care. They do need to be allowed to join a union, that unions must be recognised by Meta, and that those demands that could then flow from that union, to do with proper safe working conditions, the right to take a break, the right not to have incredibly, Martha was describing at the beginning of the show, these horrible kind of micro-surveillance way in which every minute of their working life is monitored and measured, and your pay relates to whether you're getting through a certain number of content. So there's no time to take a break. And, you've just seen the most horrific thing happen, whatever it may be. Understandably, you might want to just take yourself away from the screen for 5 minutes and come back. But the kind of metrics and the kind of the sort of demands in terms of targets means that's almost impossible.
Bringing these sorts of conversations about how the world works, how our systems work, and how we can make the world a better place had me tied up in knots for ages because one of the obstacles I created for myself was the challenge of finding a sponsor that I could tell you about and still hold my head up high. Triodos Bank has been a front runner as one of the world's leading ethical and sustainable banks for over 40 years. Their mission is simple: to use money for positive change, and this has been their guiding principle in everything they do. So far, so good. Until we started recording this episode and I was like, shit, where do they stand on digital privacy policies? Do you know what? I'm so glad I asked. Because when it comes to privacy and data protection, Triodos is very clear. They maintain each individual should maintain power and control over their own life, including personal data. This calls for freedom of choice, fairness and transparency on data collection, processing, and usage. Data is valuable, and Triodos has an obligation to ensure the data it holds is accurate, secure, and confidential. You can read for yourself in their annual report on their website. And given everything I've learned recording this episode, these words make it a genuine pleasure for me to be able to tell you about Triodos, and makes me really proud to have Triodos as the exclusive sponsors for If I Rule the World. So I'm just sort of like putting myself in the position of a listener coming to this, perhaps not someone based in Kenya, someone based here in the UK or Sweden. Apparently, I've got a lot of listeners in Sweden. And how does this matter to someone here? I mean, aside from, if you've got a conscience and you've just heard everything you've both shared, does it affect me? No. Do I care? Yes. But, is there more to it than this?
Definitely. I think, Rose has just been talking through the cases that we've been bringing in Kenya or been supporting in Kenya. But I think the harms both on the platform in terms of using it as a user and engaging in what you see day to day. And, there are many of these workers in Europe, we should say as well, who work in similar conditions. It's pretty bad in the English-speaking world too. I mean, we've seen lots of reporting of things, for example, like the types of ads that are served or the types of information that teenage girls see, for example, on Instagram or on Facebook about the dieting apps or other sorts of awful things that teenage girls shouldn't see. And so, yes, the harms are much worse, as Rosa said, in the non-English-speaking world, but they're pretty bad here too. And I think one thing that, you asked earlier what the platform's responsibility is, I think to put it into perspective, a third of the planet uses a Meta tool, whether that's Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp. So Facebook or Meta rather, is setting the kind of terms of access for a third of the world to information, to news, to what we see. And so this really does affect everybody. And in terms of users of those platforms, but also workers, that, like Rosa was saying, that there are thousands of or hundreds of workers in Kenya, but that's true of across Europe as well.
And maybe just to think a little bit, I mean, social media depends on advertising. It depends on virality. You have to keep on watching, you have to keep on posting, you have to keep on sharing. That's its source of income. And I think if you can turn down some of that virality at the source, suddenly the profits of these companies begin to wither away. And I think one of the things that has been so worrying for us at Foxglove is that nation-state regulators have just turned they really have turned, it's like no one's been home. They've turned a blind eye. And I think if you were to imagine, for example, if the regulators in Europe or in the US or indeed in Kenya or in South Africa, if there was suddenly a kind of desire to make sure that the monopoly, and it really is a monopoly that these companies are exercising, if suddenly, let's say, Facebook didn't have such a control over social media, or Meta didn't, and as Martha was saying, actually a huge proportion of the world logs on, and actually for some countries, social media is in effect the entire internet. I think if there was more choice, if you could vote with your feet, go somewhere more decent, less clickbaity, your kids could go somewhere more decent, I actually think that is what we would do. But at the moment, there is such a monopoly of these companies. These companies are so huge. And the regulators, to be honest, have not been intervening and preventing them from getting bigger. Because one of the other myths about these companies is that it's all kind of new, genius, technological advancement. Actually, for loads of these companies, it's just about buying other small companies and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So you've seen you've seen Meta buy endless new things.
So does the legal infrastructure already exist internationally to prevent this from happening? It's not being used properly. It's not being enacted. What's the problem, basically?
So I think that there is definitely a whole new suite of legislation that is required. But what we're doing at Foxglove is saying, actually, what you have on the books now, you're just not using in the way that you should be using. So as litigators in the current legal space, what we do is we look to see what laws can be applied now. And we use a variety of different legislation depending on which country we're kind of operating in and also what issue we're tackling. So maybe to take a totally different example, one of the first cases we took was against the Home Office here. Because the Home Office had in place, and they'd had it in place for about 5 years, so completely secret, completely invisible, an algorithm which was basically grading visa applicants. So you would apply for a visa, and the algorithm would basically process your data, and out of it would come a decision of whether you were high risk or low risk applicant. And if you were a high risk applicant, then you would have a pretty thorough analysis by a caseworker to decide whether you get a visa or not. And if you were low risk, then the caseworker would basically say, yeah, that's fine. Do a very kind of short analysis of whether there needs to be any further investigation. And you're very likely to get the visa. We challenged that algorithm because it became clear to us, and again, thanks to a whistleblower, thanks to somebody who had the courage to talk to the Financial Times and admit the fact that this algorithm existed. So for 5 years, no one knew it existed. It wasn't in the public domain. As I said, there was one brave person who came and admitted to a journalist at the FT. We happened to read that article. And with the amazing JCWI, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, we challenged the Home Office, saying that use of that algorithm is unlawful. And we challenged it on the basis of discrimination. So as we know, algorithms have so often an inherent bias. This particular algorithm, there was literally a list of dodgy nations, as they called it, which they decided if you happened to be an applicant from that country, then you were much more likely to be risky in terms of being awarded a visa. So it was just straight up discrimination. And so we challenged it on basis of equality, discrimination. We challenged it on the basis of fairness. We had some GDPR, some data protection arguments as well. And we said, look, this is not lawful. This is not a fair process. It's completely secret and it discriminates unlawfully against a selection of applicants who just happen to come from that particular country. And I'm pleased to say the Home Office saw sense and withdrew the algorithm. And I think in some ways what that case really revealed to us was that there is probably a whole host of algorithms being used and technology and AI being used across government that we don't know about. And the second it comes to light, and the second we are able to review what in fact this algorithm is doing, and we are able to challenge it if it is unlawful, then the government here certainly gave in. And to be honest, they've given in on the other cases we've taken too. So, for example, we challenged the A-level algorithm. I don't know if you remember, but
I do.
Quite soon after this foundation of Foxglove, we had almost like a kind of gift given to us because we were trying to kind of talk about algorithms and bias and talk about the problems inherent in them. And then, of course, we had this absolutely disastrous algorithm that was put in place that was really harming children who, again, kids who are performing extremely well, but just happened to be in a school where the historical record in terms of A-level results hadn't been so good. And those young adults, teenagers, were losing up to 2 grades under the algorithm. So they'd done all of that hard work and suddenly their their names, their grades are put through the algorithm, and suddenly they've lost 2 grades, which has the most huge impact on their kind of future and career. And so suddenly everyone saw and could see and could feel the impact of an algorithm. Suddenly all the predicted grades that had been carefully gone through by the individual teachers for the individual person were set aside. An algorithm was used and new grades came out that were disastrous for lots of people. And suddenly people could feel and they could see the impact of the use of this technology. And we had amazing scenes of students, you know, on the streets saying, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but fuck the algorithm. And it was being discussed over breakfast and over lunch. And it was suddenly, you know, an issue that everyone was really anxious, quite rightly anxious about. And in that case, again, we challenged them. We explained why we thought it was unlawful and desperately unfair. And they chose to scrap it again and to go back to the individual-based, carefully considered individual grades that had been predicted for each student at that time.
I think Rosa touched on this, but one of the things that's been particularly interesting about the cases that we've brought in the UK, challenging different government departments for use of kind of secretive or discriminatory algorithms, has been that, as Rosa gave the example, each time we've gone to court or we've threatened to go to court, the algorithm has either been scrapped or changed or paused. And so I think, you know, it shows actually perhaps there is a moment of thought, a bit more thought that is required prior to rolling out these algorithms and using them to make very consequential decisions about the lives of people in terms of visas or education or benefits. And like Rosa said too, I think in the UK the UK government has a very, very secretive culture. And the only way that we've known about these systems has been, you know, through whistleblowers or through reports or that are buried on page 369 or something. Mm-hmm. There are better and different ways to do this. Yeah. We've seen in other, I don't think it's all about transparency. I think it's partly about making sure the systems are fair, but I think that's certainly an important first step. And if you look at other places in Europe, for example, I think it was Amsterdam and Helsinki, they have quite good models around algorithm use within government. So public bodies there have a duty to provide information about the systems that are in use and give information about what assessments they've done to ensure that these systems aren't resulting in discrimination or unfairness. And, you know, making that available to the public and the people that these systems are used to make decisions about.
I think the secrecy and lack of transparency, at least for me, is a very big part of it. I know we've talked a lot more generally about particularly social media, its influence, but there's, I guess, an ongoing case with the NHS, how it's going to do this massive leap and digitize the data, sort of, you know, have this really transformational digitization of all the information, all our personal health data. And that was one of the things that I felt I really wanted to ask you guys about, because on the one hand, let's say, you know, I sort of decided to do my little snooping around on the internet that I always do when I'm curious about something. And I looked up Palantir and I looked up their own sort of talks and presentations. And a lot of it, if I'm honest, when I was looking at, you know, especially they had like a recruitment video, and I thought, these people actually, you know, just all look like really nice people. They all seem fairly liberal. They all young, intelligent engineers and writing code every day and playing table tennis for lunch, and they've got their company dogs and welfare dogs. I was like, this looks like pretty much any place that I would say, you know, is a great place to work. And even, I mean, I remember there was one of the young engineers, a woman who said that, you know, I think her quote was something like, it was important to me, what I do matters, and I want to make the world a better place. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, so this is really interesting. I think we all walk around with this idea of what a better place looks like. And for me, part of the issue here is, like, I don't like the idea of this overreach of big tech into my life, mainly because I'm not familiar with it. I got to my adult life, you know, without the internet. I sort of began my professional life when the internet was a baby, you know, so I have a good working memory of what life was like before all of this happened. And so I think I'm naturally a cautious person. I'm actually quite small c conservative in the sense that I'm like, if we've only got one planet, let's take our time with the changes and let's take our time with the decisions and adopting new technologies. But my question really is, how do we elevate this discussion that goes beyond any one person's sense of what is right or wrong, and beyond any one person's sense of what it will take to make the world a better place? And how do we make sure that essentially everyone has agency, everyone has access to this information, everyone is fully aware of the influence of technology in their lives? I mean, what do you think the solution is?
I think health is quite an interesting place to start. So you were just talking about Palantir's recently having been awarded the contract for the most recent effort to centralise all of our health data in the UK, something called the Federated Data Platform. And the spy tech firm Palantir have been awarded £330 million to run that. But I think there's an interesting question there, because something that the government has consistently flip-flopped on over the last, efforts to centralise data go back quite some time, right back to the Tony Blair government when there was an effort to centralise data. There was another effort in 2014 and there was another effort in 2021. And then this is the most recent effort. And I think many people can see that centralising and using health data in a way that benefits the NHS is a good thing. Mm-hmm. But a real question about all of this is around patient trust. So many of the reasons that all of these systems before have fallen over are because many people, when they were asked, when their consent was sought about whether or not they wanted their data to be shared with private companies, said no thank you. And so many people opted out that those systems fell over. And I think on this recent kind of effort to centralise data, the Federated Data Platform, like I said, the government's flip-flopped multiple times. And I think on whether or not they'll seek patient consent prior to using this platform and putting data into this platform. And I think patient consent and patient choice, and perhaps this applies to data more generally. I think it does apply to data more generally outside of the NHS, which is to say there's a really important place for kind of public consultation and engagement on the systems that are used and how they're used and what data they use. But in the context of NHS health data, like you were just talking about, there's a really important place for patient choice and patient consent to ensure that there's patient trust, which is what's needed for an effective health system in the UK.
So we need to be asked first, basically.
We need to be asked.
Okay.
And to say something, Foxglove is very clear that data could be handled better by the NHS. We've all got our stories. Corrie always tells us, Corrie herself has this experience of having to. She had a test done at a hospital, and in order to get it to her GP to get it back in the quickest way possible, it would take 7 to 10 days if she let it happen within the NHS system. She literally got on her bike and rode her test from the hospital to her GP practice. And that really illustrates that there is a problem with the NHS in terms of how data is managed and how to make sure it flows better between the different NHS trusts and bodies. The question for us is, how will you do that? And for any federated data platform like the ones being proposed, for it to work, it needs to be wanted by the doctors and the hospital trusts, and it needs to be trusted by patients. Because at the cornerstone of the entire NHS system is a trust and a sense of confidence between you and your doctor. And the second you suddenly think, for example, Palantir is in that room with you, you're going to start saying some things that are very, very different. And the reason you're going to say things that are different is because Palantir is most famous and most known for their role in extrajudicial killing in Pakistan on behalf of the CIA, and in terms of trying to separate families at the US-Mexico border under the Trump administration. This is not a company that is immediately apparent to us as a good partner for the National Health Service. And so we need to have absolutely cast iron guarantees from this government that there will be no corporate access to this NHS data, our personal most sensitive health data that goes from when we're born to when we die, that there is no access to corporations, whether it's big tech or otherwise. And of course, big tech are they are hovering around NHS data. This is machine readable data that would be so valuable to their machine learning. We know that. We need to protect it. And so the government needs to give an absolute cast iron guarantee that corporations will have no access to this data unless we give our very, very, very explicit consent for that particular use. And there has to be an absolute guarantee that there won't be other bits of government, like, for example, the Home Office or DWP, being able to dip into NHS data. Because again, with either of those scenarios, we have that breakdown of trust. And we all want to share our data with the NHS in order to improve the NHS as a public service and in order to make sure that we get our best personal care. But we need those cast iron guarantees, which the government could give, again, tomorrow. These are not big asks. These are asks that are inherent in the kind of benefit of the NHS. And these are things that we should be asking the government, we should be demanding, and the government should be providing us with those guarantees so that we don't have this anxiety about whether to continue to speak openly with our doctors or whether our information is suddenly accessible to Google or somebody else. And I think it's incredibly important that we have that guarantee. And as I said, this can be easily provided.
I think the people listening to this, I'm going to make an assumption here, will maybe be hearing this for the first time, might be of the mind that I don't have anything to hide, so I don't see why this is a problem. What I want is a public service that works better. What I want is, public services to be more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. What is it that you feel people do need to know in order to make that informed consent?
So to be clear, the last thing we want to see is people opting out of sharing their data with the NHS. The NHS is a public service, and I think it's one of the most cherished and loved services in our country. And it's one I know certainly when I go abroad, I feel most proud of when I think about our country. So from a Foxglove perspective, it's absolutely crucial that we create a situation where people do not need to opt out of sharing their data with the NHS. And the way to do that is for the government to make clear, because the issue, why people choose to opt out is because they are anxious about who will have access to their data. Because this data is this is the most sensitive, most personal information,
How could it be exploited though? How do you, what are the risks there other than just a sense of I don't want people to know what they've done to my lady bits or whatever, but how is it exploitable?
So NHS data has been valued as worth 11 billion a year. And the reason for that is NHS data it's unique because it's machine readable, i.e. computers can read it with ease compared to some other health data. And also it dates from 45 onwards, and there's a really extraordinary history and wealth and depth of data in relation to a whole nation state. So this is the kind of data which someone like Google, for example, would love to get their mitts on, because suddenly they'll be able to use it for machine learning for their programs. So if you think about something like Fitbit, actually having access to this amount of health data would be incredibly useful for them. So at the moment, the government is stating that this platform will only be used for primary care, for your own personal care, basically, which just to remind everyone, NHS England doesn't normally deliver primary care, so I'm slightly unclear why NHS England needs the data for that purpose. But anyway, they are saying that the only real case use at the moment is about your own kind of personal care. When they advertised for the companies to bid for this platform, Palantir being one of them, they set out 5 uses. And they made clear that they were expecting other uses to need to be incorporated into the platform. Now, which one is true? And when you're talking about such personal sensitive data, you need absolute crystal clear clarity on this, because particularly in the context where we know NHS data is so valuable to companies and people are very anxious about companies getting access to that data, we need the government to be clear that they're not going to allow that to happen. And if they were to take that step, if they were to be clear and give that cast iron commitment, data will not be shared with private corporations or other parts of government like Home Office or DWP, then I think we would see, and I'm hopeful, that people would choose not to opt out, that actually people want to invest in the NHS. They don't mind their data being shared for the benefit and purpose of the public service, which serves us all so well in terms of our medical care.
I think, just to build on what Rosa's just said, I think there's a real moment here for the government to get this right and for this system to not follow the fate of those before it, which has been that many people have opted out and that the system ultimately didn't continue. Because I think most people, like Rosa was saying, would want their data to be used in a way that benefits the NHS and not in a way that lines the pockets of private companies.
So sharing our data could be the sort of digital equivalent of wanting to be an organ donor. So, in the right way, with the right consent given and full transparency of how this data is going to be used, it could actually be used for a greater good. However, that's what we're missing at the moment. So if we were talking about organ donors, if you don't know if I'm an organ donor and I don't know where that's going to go and how it's going to be used, I might not feel so comfortable with that system. So this is the digital equivalent of that. Is that maybe an oversimplification?
There would be a real opportunity here for the NHS to change the way in which they manage data. So it could be useful both for their own decisions about, when your local hospital trust decides what different sort of services does it need to provide for to serve its local community. It partly makes those decisions having reviewed the NHS data that it holds about why people are going, for example, to their GP. So you build up a picture of what the health needs are of your local area, and then you make sure that the NHS is providing those services so those needs can be met. That's incredibly important that NHS data kind of flows and is able to be used in that way for the better of the NHS. And our impression is that most people want that actually people want the NHS data to be managed and used better. They don't want to have to cycle their records from one hospital trust to your GP practice. But actually, they don't want to do that if there is a risk that data is going to be sold or be opened up to private corporations, or there's going to be a sudden way in which the Home Office, who's assessing your visa application, can suddenly know the basis on which you went to see your doctor. And we know, for example, when the pandemic hit, there was a real worry and an anxiety about how different parts of different state bodies were talking to each other. When people don't trust their health services, for example, they're worried that, that you're going to talk to DWP about your benefits or you're going to talk to the Home Office, people choose not to come to see their doctors. And that's a huge problem for all of us in terms of public health.
I think, what I'm hearing, though, that, this ultimately, it reaches into these really kind of sort of some of the most basic principles about relationships, the way we work as society, good governance, which is trust and transparency. And that's something that seems to be lacking in this process as well as others. So this is going to be an interesting one because I get to ask both of you this, as I ask every guest, actually. You probably have heard it now. If you ruled the world, what would you do, Martha?
Well, if I were to rule the world, I certainly wouldn't do it alone. I would do it with Corey and Rosa. So Rosa and I have actually already colluded and have one answer. So Rosa, do you want to, over to you?
So if you ruled the world, or if indeed we ruled the world, we would ask for big tech to be broken up. We think these companies are too big and they need to be broken up into much smaller pieces. I was talking at the start of the programme about how in the tech sector and in the big tech companies, you see some of the world's richest men so rich, for example, where we had like Jeff Bezos dismantling an entire bridge in order to move his super yacht out of a town. These men have so much money, and the Silicon Valley fable has all of the wrong heroes in our view. We've been told that these tech giants have created and risen based on their own individual genius, whether it's Mark in his dorm, Steve in his garage, Elon on his couch, that the rare talent of these very few men, as their story goes, has given us the world's most powerful corporations. And this justifies their position in some of the most unequal kind of post-industrialized nations in the world. And this myth really matters because it creates what we consider to be social assent for the big tech dominance. And with that assent, that social assent for their dominance, we think there is absolutely disastrous consequences, whether it's for labour, workers' rights, which we've obviously spoken a lot about, tax, we see horrendous practices by all these companies, the climate, Amazon and environment is an absolute disaster, privacy, and all of our democracies. When you think about, for example, Jeff Bezos's fortune compared to, for example, the warehouse staff who we've been doing lots of work with in Coventry, he makes the median Amazon salary in less than 10 seconds. Wow. Like, that inequality is horrific. We think there is beginning to be a more true story that is beginning to gain force, and we're certainly trying to push it as much as we possibly can. That in fact, a bit like, we've had both with steel and oil and farming, that these huge corporations, they're not unicorns. That in fact, their vast wealth and their vast unacceptable level of power, it all stands on a mountain of undervalued labour. This is not because of the genius of a few. There are so many thousands of people who are absolutely at the core of all of these businesses. And I think if we start to imagine a world in which, for example, we put Mr. Smalls, who's obviously so famous for being involved in creating the first union at Amazon in the US, if we put him in the centre of the frame, or we put our wonderful client Daniel in the centre of a frame in terms of what Facebook looks like, in terms of being able to have a unionised workforce. And if we really push to show, in fact, that these cultures of fear and secrecy that all of these big tech companies have spent years perfecting to try and slow the roll in terms of workers unionising. They've created precarious jobs. They've failed to keep people safe. They've obscured the kind of importance of this work from all of us, investing millions and millions and millions in anti-union lobbying. And so far, big tech has not been asked to pay for the misery that they've caused. But we think that we are at the cusp of a moment of change where actually tech workers are globally organising. They are building collective power and they're fighting back. And we think people like Chris, like Daniel, like Amanda and Stuart, who are doing amazing work in Coventry for Amazon workers here, they are standing up to these corporations and demanding union recognition. And that power, that workers' power, is speaking directly to these corporations in a way that we truly think that these wins can be built on and change can really happen. And these companies will hopefully become smaller and smaller. And that will be a massive benefit to us all.
I know this is going to be a weird segue, but something about all of this reminds me of a clip. It's on YouTube. It's probably about 15 years old now. And the audio is pretty horrible, pretty racist, actually. So mute it if you like. But it's like lines and lines and lines and lines of sewage trucks queuing for days in the desert, waiting to empty their tankers, only to return and head back to the skyscrapers of Dubai to fill them up and do it all over again. This is what that technology feels like to me. Like those shiny skyscrapers on the one hand, the digital revolution, the internet, AI, social media is the height of human ingenuity and ambition and achievement, depending on what you think ambition and achievement and ingenuity is. This whole technology depends heavily on heavily exploited human skill and labor that is all too often hidden away and treated as completely dispensable. So that's one takeaway. The other takeaway is the lack of transparency. The fact that so few of us are aware of this. At least I wasn't. Aware of this exploitative, now these are my words, ruthless, nasty underbelly that is hidden away from the vast majority of us that either don't have the time or simply don't know to look deeper into this. And note, I didn't say don't care, because you know what? I really believe this. I think a lot of people do care. I'm going to be straight. These podcast episodes go out every 2 weeks, and I'm starting to notice a little bit of a pattern. Every midpoint between the two, I hit a low point. I start to kind of feel really overwhelmed. These problems are too big, but then I get to share stories like the one today. It fucking fires me up again. And I'm swearing because listening to Martha and Rosa, I think they would have loved to have gone off on a sweary rant, but they didn't. They didn't because the most important tools of their trade is precise language that clearly defines the challenges and transgressions accurately so that the law can be applied to hold people in power to account. So if you want to find out more about Foxglove's work or any of the people and organizations that get featured in this or other episodes of If I Rule the World, you can look in the show notes where you'll find links to websites, campaign pages where you can get involved, you can make donations, or simply spread the word in your community, no matter how small. I would really appreciate it if you share this podcast with someone, even just one person who you think will get some value out of it. And if you want to be the first to know when new episodes of If I Rule the World drop, then hit the follow button or sign up to my newsletter. It's short and sweet, I promise, on my website, gillianburkevoice.com. By the way, the newsletter is going through a little makeover, but it's going to be out soon. Oh, that was a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, really. Take a few breaths, let it all sink in, and maybe have a little think to yourself. If you rule the world, what would you do?